Changeworking, moving minds for change that lasts.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Changeworking, a show for practitioners and coaches who help their clients create change. My name is Ruckus, and as always, I'll be in conversation with James Tripp. In this episode, we're going to continue what we started in the last episode, things that have influenced James beyond NLP, Ericksonian hypnosis, or clean language. And there's a lot of them. Today, we're going to dig into Byron Katie, general semantics, REBT, and solution-focused brief therapy. So here we go. Here's my conversation with James.
Byron Katie.
The work of Byron Katie. Okay, so again, Byron Katie's work is again in the area of what I would call I call these black path approaches, this black path and white path approaches. I've used this distinction before. A black path approach for me is an approach that disassembles or dismisses or dissipates the very pervasive illusions that our egos create and our ideas about the world create. So you could say that, in a sense, Korzybski's stuff is black path stuff. As soon as we become a witness to our own sense-making processes, we can fall out of those processes. 3 principles. You live 100% within the feeling of your thinking, and when you see that thinking, you deconstruct it, or you don't deconstruct it in 3 principles, you fall out of it, right, into your well-being. Rational emotive behavior therapy. You start to see something of the processes, your belief processes. That's a more deconstructive approach. Right? It's not just seeing the nature of the thoughts. It's looking at the structure of the thoughts and challenging and taking those apart. But again, you fall out of beliefs that had you before. So I call all of these things black path approaches. And there's a degree of black path in Erickson's work as well, in that you don't have to do anything you don't need to know. So you're falling out of the conscious mind and into this unconscious creative mind. Byron Katie is another black path approach. So she's got this idea, like her first book was called Loving What Is. And the message of Loving What Is that the world is as it is. Right? It just is as it is. There's nothing you can do about that. It is as it is. Now, it doesn't mean your thoughts about it are what the world is, but the world is as it is. There's a thing called reality, and it is what it is, right? As the old saying goes, it is what it is. So you can either live in argument with reality, or you can live in harmony with reality. You can love what is, right? And there's a line from Byron Katie I love, and I've used many times, is if you ever see somebody in an argument with reality, put your money on reality, because it will win every time. She'd probably say, because it will win. So you're looking at these arguments with reality. How do we create an argument with reality? Because we only suffer when we're arguing with reality. There's a kind of Buddhist thing going on there. Experience plus resistance equals suffering, as one Buddhist meditation teacher once put it. So she's got this process she calls the work. And the idea of the work is to take you out of argument with reality so that you can just love what is. You can just be with what is. And her process is centered around 4 questions and what she calls turnarounds. So the first question of the Byron Katie work is that true? First question. Now, she'll often start the work, she'll prime people up by having them do what she calls a judge thy neighbor worksheet, right? It's just like, and this is what pisses you off in the world, right? What really gets you like angry. So it could be judge your neighbor, judge the world, judge your work colleague, right? It's this idea that we're going to judge, we're going to live in judgment, and the judgment's going to cause us suffering. So it might be, I can't stand it when Bob treats me with disrespect, right? Let's say that's a judgment. So underneath of that, you want to get the should, again, a bit like Ellis, you look for the should. It doesn't have to be a should, but it often is. So Bob should treat me with respect. It's the hidden rule. So question 1, so Bob should treat you with respect. Is that true? It's question number 1. Now, often people might go yes to that, to which you'll move on to question number 2. Can you absolutely know that it's true? Right? Now, most people will go, well, no, but it feels true. or something like that. So no, you can't know that it's true. So how do you feel, question 3, how do you feel when you're caught up in that belief, Bob should treat me with respect, and Bob is not respecting you? I feel terrible. I feel painful. And she'll often weave these reframes, and she'll go and she'll say, oh, sweetie, that's what it's like when you believe a lie, because that's the argument with reality. So it'd be like, how do you respond? How do you react when you believe that and you're not getting that right? I feel tight. I feel upset. So she's got 4 questions, but she often asks this one. I don't know if this is one of the questions or not, but could you think so? Can you see a peaceful reason for keeping hold of this belief? I love that question. And if you say, can you see a reason for keeping hold of this belief? People will come up with reasons. But when you ask, could you see a peaceful reason for keeping hold of this belief? That's given that they've just acknowledged the pain it's causing them. And the answer you're aiming for is no. It's a leading question. And then you ask the question, so who would you be without this story? Who would you be without this thought? The thought being, Bob should treat me with respect or whatever, or people should treat me with respect. And you're just inviting somebody into that place of who would you be. I found if I ask that question, people often will say, well, I'd still be me. I'd be me, but, or sometimes I'd be more truly me, but it's like, there's often I'll be me, but. So you got those, that was 5 questions. I'm aware of that. So one of them's an additional question. I don't know which it is. But she'll go through that process, but she does a lot of elegant reframing. That's the bare bones of her work, but there's a lot of elegant reframing. Then you're going to get these turnarounds at the end. Now, these turnarounds are they're clever, actually. I really like the way you do this. So you want to get like 2 or 3, ideally 3 turnarounds at least. So let's say like, Bob should treat me with respect is the belief. One turnaround will be, I should treat Bob with respect. Now, the idea is if you could connect into the truth of the first one, you connect into the truth of the turnarounds. You find the truth. It's like, just feel it, right? Yeah, I should treat Bob with respect. Is that true? Yeah, I can feel the truth of that. I should treat Bob with respect. I should treat me with respect. There's another turnaround. It's like, oh yeah, I should treat me with respect, right? Maybe another turnaround on that is Bob shouldn't treat me with respect. So turnarounds are just like in any kind of inversions of the belief that you can do. You can do it by switching the referent and the subject and the object of the sentence. You can do it by turning the should into a shouldn't. You can do it by just directing back to self. So those are the sort of 3 standard mechanisms. And you get somebody to really feel these 3 different truths that obviously once they sit in the same space, they kind of blow out the broader tight conditions of the held structure. That last bit's almost more like, I would say, a hypnotic piece. Somebody can't do that intellectually. They want to really feel the truth of each of the turnarounds. And they can't really go back to the old position so easily anymore. They have a lot more fluidity and flexibility around it. So that's the work of Byron Katie. Again, it's a kind of black path approach. It can fit hand in glove with 3 principles work, with REBT work, with anything that sits on that kind of black path side that's around dissolving existing structures that are causing problems or releasing existing structures.
Did her framework for the work come out of some other system, or is it something she just came up with?
She has a story that she was a terrible, terrible person, like an awful person and an alcoholic and everything. And she was in a women's refuge at some point, and she was drinking very heavily and using drugs and was just a terrible person by her own account. And then she had this experience of lying on the floor and like they put her in the top room because she was so horrible she couldn't interact with anyone else in the hostel. And she was lying there just on the floor. And suddenly he just had an epiphany and a breakthrough that she was nothing, basically, and that, there were no problems in the world, or I can't remember the nature of her breakthrough. She just had this awakening experience, like Sydney Banks' awakening experience. There's so many stories of people having awakening experiences, and that's the origin of their new path in life.
Has she written a book called The Work?
The only book I've ever read from her is Loving What Is, which was her first book. I think she's written other books. Loving What Is good. And I always do recommend, for Loving What Is, I do recommend people get the Audible version of that or the audiobook version of that, because in the written book, there's some transcripts of her doing the work with people. But on the audiobook, those are the actual sessions, her working with the people. So you get to hear her actually working with a real life human being on a real life thing. And I actually really do rate her as a facilitator of change, as a changework practitioner. You know, like I said, this will be in another episode where I said I loved Ellis and I was really disappointed with him as a practitioner.
Right.
Byron Katie, I think, is absolutely phenomenal as a facilitator and as a practitioner. I think she does her work so elegantly, so beautifully. And I think people from an NLP perspective might be inclined to listen to it and go, wow, she does a lot of really, really clever reframing. So that's what an NLPer might say. If you spoke to Byron Katie and said, you know, you do so much clever reframing, she'd probably look at you like, what the hell are you talking about? And you say, oh, those moments where you do this thing. And she said, oh, no, that's just speaking the truth. So you could look at it as a reframe, or you could look at it as her re-truthing or connecting to a deeper truth. But, you know, it kind of functions the same way because it's helping to reorganize the person's reality, their way of seeing and the way of being that comes from that through the work that she's doing.
General semantics.
Okay, so general semantics as well. I'm going to give you one of my COD histories on this. I'm always aware that I'm not a scholar, so I just have to rely on my memory, and sometimes my dates might be a bit skewed. But general semantics is the creation of a guy called Alfred Korzybski, Count Alfred Korzybski.
Who is the Count?
Yeah, and he was Hungarian, I believe, Count Alfred Korzybski. Now, he was a count, but then things changed in early Europe and he stopped being a count and just became a regular guy. And one of the things that he found life brought his way was a stint in the German army during World War One. And he had a bad time, as I'd imagine everybody in any army involved in World War One had a bad time. And one of the things that he just could not fathom is, you know, he's in this place, it's literally for him, it was hell on earth, with these people trying to kill each other who didn't even know each other and couldn't possibly have any personal grievance. So to him, it was just a complete situation of what he would call unsanity. Like, what had happened? How did this happen? So he became absolutely fascinated about how could an event like this, something so awful, come about? And then post the Second World War, he then saw other things occur which culminated in the rise of fascism and all of this sort of thing. And he became absolutely fascinated in how human beings got captured by crazy ideas to the point to which they would just do awful things. This was his thing. And he called this unsanity, not insanity, but unsanity. There was a lack of sanity. And to him, it was just to do with the ideas. It was to do with our processes of perception and our ideas and how they took us down a chain of inferences. And we would end up in this kind of mind-made reality that wasn't reality, but really seemed like it. So again, very similar to Three Principles in some ways, but in the flavor of it, very different. So he came up with this term, the map is not the territory. He wrote a book, it's up there somewhere, it's like a very, very thick book called Science and Sanity. And he called it Science and Sanity because he believed that the true scientific method, that when people thought more scientifically, i.e. they stood back and looked at their own prejudices of perception, that they would be able to witness their own processes and be critical about their own processes and therefore not be so readily had by crazy ideas. So this is why, you know, I'm often saying people are poor witnesses to their own processes. This is probably an influence, now I'm thinking about it, from general semantics. So there's an idea, sort of one idea in at least one rendering of general semantics, one lineage, which is the distinction between essentialism versus operationalism. So essentialist, Korzybski looks a lot at language. It's a lot of looking at language and how we make sense with language. And one of his big things was the verb to be, I am, or you are, that is, right? That is good, that is bad, right? The is puts an essence into something that is not necessarily a part of the thing. So let's say you and I, to Ruckus, Beatles or the Stones? Stones, right? You're wrong. The Beatles are clearly a more important band, right? Clearly.
Right.
So if I say that, I'm being essentialist. I go, no, the Beatles are clearly a more important band, right? There's the verb to be. The Beatles are. So to me, importance is part of the essence of the Beatles. It's a fact that that's what the Beatles are.
Mm-hmm.
And you could go, no, the Rolling Stones, they were way ahead of the Beatles or whatever. We could argue forever and ever. And we're both falling for the idea of my map is the territory and you think your map is the territory.
Right.
Right. So the Beatles are greater than the Stones. No, the Stones are greater than the Beatles. Right. I happen to be a Stones guy in reality. I want to make that clear for anybody listening to this.
I wish I had said the Beatles, so that's really
Yeah,
funny.
then it could have been honest.
I regret saying the Stones.
I'm more of a Stones guy. They got more swagger. But, there we go. As John Lennon said, Paul McCartney's granny music. It doesn't do it for me. So anyway, aside from that, so this is like being essentialist. But as operationalists would be, well, the Beatles seem like a more important band to me at this point in history. That's an operationalist statement because I am owning my own operations of evaluation and perception. Right? So what general semantics does is it encourages you to own your processes and be cognizant of your processes of evaluation, right? So that you're avoiding the is, right? Rather than the Stones are terrible and the Beatles are great. The Stones seem like a more accomplished band of musicians to me from my set of filters at this particular point in time in history. Right. Now, that's an overblown way. So he's not saying you should speak like this all the time, but he does say you should speak like this for some of the time to get yourself into the habit of having a little bit of humility about your own evaluations and not being so arrogant. So it's really about keeping a more open mind, recognizing this. He also has a thing what he calls the structural differential, I think, which is this weird thing for figuring out how we go from reality, the information that comes into our senses, through different sort of transformations and down a cascade of inferences till we arrive at what we think is true. Right? So somebody who says, I think my boss is definitely going to fire me. Right? Well, what makes you think that? I went in today and I could just tell. You could just see it on his face. It's like that person's gone down a cascade of inferences and they've come to a conclusion. It's like, well, what did you see on his face? Well, he just had this frown and was scowling the whole time. It's like, okay, so you saw something and then you went down a cascade of inferences and arrived at a conclusion that you are now sure is true and you're not even aware of the cascade of influences. You've basically gone, his face equals he's going to fire me. So people do this kind of thing all the time. And it's like starting to recognize and training yourself to be aware of your own processes, the inferences you go through, bringing more consciousness that you go, right. So you've got certain things like ideas of report language versus inference language. If in staying in report language, you just go, my boss has got some tightness in his muscles around his forehead. And that could mean many, many things. So the report language doesn't go down the cascade of inferences. But you go down the cascade of inferences and you get into this world of, so it's just starting to look at your own sense-making processes. How are they playing out in any given moment? Becoming more aware of that, having more consciousness of it, and developing different habits of attention and thought around those processes so that you're able to free yourself from being had by certainties that are not even remotely certain. For example, you could say, like, you get some crackpot dictator who's going to like orchestrate some genocide against people because those people are bad people and they haven't sat down and met any of them. They haven't had a meal with any of them, or they're caught up in their idea. These people are. So it's the kind of isness of the thing that creates the trap.
So it's general semantics, simply ideas that he's sharing, or has it been formed into some sort of framework for people to do change work with?
It's not really a change work thing, although,
Okay.
I mean, it can be, and it has informed a lot of people, and it was quite impactful for a time. So, for example, Albert Ellis, rational emotive behavior therapy, he had a big influence from general semantics. And I have read, if I'm remembering this rightly, I read a biography of Korzybski, and supposedly Korzybski was much sought after by colleagues for his counsel. So he would sit down, they would go with their problems, he would sit and talk with them from a general semantics perspective, and they would get shifts and liberation and this sort of thing. So it can be applied in that context, but it's not for that context, it's for life. What Korzybski envisaged was that this would become, he hoped, a part of how people were educated, the world over. So that people would learn to be, the way I would put it, is better witnesses to their own processes, have tools for questioning their own processes, and perhaps keeping a little bit more of an open mind, and having a more, what he would call, scientific way of relating to the world, like less immediate certainty and more experiments and testing as to what may or may not be the case. And his goal was nothing less than, in a sense, world peace. He wanted people to stop hating on each other, to stop jumping to conclusions, stop reacting into their threat response systems. He wanted more peace, harmony, well-being on a global level, and he wanted this to become something that changed the world. That was his mission. And I sometimes think this is a sort of maybe a sad note, but I sometimes think, what would he think seeing the world today with, it can seem like at least there's more polarization than there has been at any point in my lifetime. And like Korzybski will be like, no, this is what I wanted people to see. You can't just say those people are X. So he was very interested in categories and these sorts of things and how we might distort reality through our categorization. I know for a fact that these people are evil. They all just want this.
Right.
He'd be probably thinking, I've not succeeded here in what I wanted to achieve.
So you said Science and Sanity is a huge book. Is there a more approachable, if someone wants to dip their toe and learn a little bit?
Yes, a couple of books I'd recommend. So for different reasons, I like Language in Thought and Action by Hayakawa. Language in Thought and Action. I really like that. I think that's a great book. There's a book called Drive Yourself Sane by Kodish and Kodish, which is quite a good overview of general semantics. And I will also say, from a kind of slightly quirkier perspective, and this is a sort of very personal take and a reformulation, is Robert Anton Wilson's Quantum Psychology. So Robert Anton Wilson, who's a very interesting guy for a variety of different reasons, he was very, very massively influenced by general semantics, and basically that's his general semantics book, but he's quite liberal in his own reframing of it.
REBT.
REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy. The man we're looking at here is Albert Ellis. He's the created this or brought this together. And he's got a kind of interesting story in that when he was a young man, a teenager, he had a lot of social anxiety, he had a lot of insecurity in himself. He was sort of afraid to go up and talk to people. And he read a bunch of books on Stoic philosophy, Epictetus, and this kind of thing. And he applied these ideas to himself and completely changed his life through applying the ideas of Stoicism. He was so taken with how much personal change he got from this that he decided that he would become a professional person that helps people make changes, i.e. a therapist. And he thought, wow, if this stuff made such a big difference, what will the real stuff do? He went on to learn psychoanalysis, except he was disappointed with psychoanalysis and the fact that none of his clients ever seemed to be making any changes. And he's like, oh. And he hung in the game for a bit. And then in the end, he thought, well, what if I start sharing some of the stuff that really made a difference to me? The Stoicism stuff, this kind of thing. And he'd also been influenced by general semantics. So he started to just bring this in, and he basically threw out the psychoanalysis, started doing his version of Stoicism. He built some of his own frameworks around it. And suddenly he started helping clients very quickly and very effectively. It was like, well, this is my thing now. It was originally called, I think it was just RBT to start with, just rational behavior therapy. rather than rational emotive behavior therapy. And there's a change a little later on. So that rational is just like, okay, well, I want to get into my rational head and I want to bring my sort of critical faculty to bear upon my own thoughts and assumptions. Again, so there's the influence partly from Stoicism and partly from general semantics, and be able to intervene in that process of making my suffering. In the process of this, he came up with a few ideas which were certainly for me highly impactful when I got into this, again on a personal level, not just with clients. One of the first ideas was around his thoughts on what you might call self-esteem. Now, he was very much at odds, and they were actually real kind of enemies. Nathaniel Branden, who wrote The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem, and Albert Ellis, they were really at odds when it came to their concept of self-esteem and well-being. Because Nathaniel Branden said, you want to live a life that you admire. You want to live according to your own principles and your own values, and then you will have good self-esteem. And Ellis was like, just stop self-rating. Stop playing the game of constantly self-rating. Just unhook yourself from self-rating. So one of his ideas was to start creating these mechanisms. And again, this is a sort of little bit general semanticsy, to stop tracking things up to identity and stop self-rating them. So let's say somebody knocks over a cup of coffee. Instead of going, oh, I'm such a klutz, right? They would perhaps formulate that as a statement of, even though I knocked over the coffee, my value as a human being remains neutral and constant. Right? So like a deeper philosophy that your value was intrinsic and could never be quantified or summed up or whatever, and that we were all basically equally of equal value as human beings. And maybe you'd screw up, and maybe you do a dumb thing from time to time, and maybe you'd mess up because we all do, but that isn't who you are. That's just a thing that happened, and your value as a human being remains neutral and constant. So it's this unhooking and mechanisms from unhooking from self-rating. That's one of the things that I got of it that was of real value to me. The other thing, his other obsession, is what he calls masturbation. By the way, Ellis was a New Yorker who had a foul mouth and enjoyed dirty humor. So masturbation was a thing of delight for him. It's like, well, you've been masturbating too much, he would say. And masturbation is any musts, shoulds, these things that in NLP would be called modal operators of necessity. I shouldn't do that. I mustn't do that. I should have done this by now. And they were incredibly toxic for people. They were kind of self-repressive, and they created a lot of anxiety and suffering. So he would have people unhook from masturbation. Now, I can't remember like his methods, and maybe this is more Ellis or maybe this is more me. I don't know. But that's one of the methods of unhooking, is to remind yourself every time you get caught in a should or a must or whatever, that is a rule that you are acting as if is true. Like it's actually a personal rule. That's all it is. When you say, oh, I should have learned this by now. But it's not true. That's just a personal rule. But we act like it's true, like it's a truth. So you want some way of highlighting that and getting yourself out of it. So the one that I always use, which I don't know how much of this is Ellis and how much is me, because I can't remember it such a long time ago, and you'll have heard me say this so many times, is there's no rule in the universe that says you must. So like, oh, I should have learned this by now, right? What the hell is wrong with me? So I've done a masturbation and a self-rating. So I want to be like, there's no rule in the universe that says I should have learned this by now, right? I could have learned this by now, but there's no rule in the universe that says I should. Whether I've learned it or not, my value as a human being remains neutral and constant. Right? So like there's a way of getting back to this freedom from the shoulds, the musts, the self-evaluation. That's a huge part of REBT. The other thing about REBT is I think that this is the first sort of CBT system to use the ABC model, which is the activating event, belief, and consequences. Now, some people debate this and say, no, that isn't really how we work. I'm sure there's way more nuance to how we work than this, but I think it's a valuable model. So like activating event, let's go back to that thing about my boss, right? Activating event, my boss has got a frown. My belief is that he's frowning because he's annoyed, and he's annoyed at me. That's my belief. And then the consequences, I feel like, upset and uptight, or maybe my spouse says to me, "Did you park the car like at the far end of the street?" And my belief is that that's a criticism, and so I respond by getting defensive. So there's the C. So you've got the ABC. Now, what Aaron Beck's model of CBT would do, and now, by the way, some people are listening to this, I just want to really emphasize my disclaimer is I am not a scholar. So do not take everything I say as being fact, right? Someone might go, no, you're wrong about that. And I've had this before. So I'm just saying this. I don't really care because I'm not trying to be a scholar. I just use stuff that's useful to me. But as I understand it, Aaron Beck's model of CBT will often challenge the belief, right? So let's say somebody has a belief, my boss hates me, right? So to challenge at the level of belief, you might go, well, how do you know your boss hates you? Do we really know it's true that your boss hates you? Actually, no, we don't know it's true. Or my boss is going to fire me. And it's like, well, you don't know that your boss is going to fire you. So you could challenge that level of beliefs. Now, what I like about Albert Ellis is he's like, okay, let's assume your boss fires you. Then what? He's much more willing to go to the worst case scenario instead of like, oh, it might not be as bad as you think it is. Well, let's assume it is as bad as you think it is. Then what? I think that's so much more of a powerful place to go to. It's like the equivalent of, instead of going, oh, it might never happen, of like, well, let's assume that it does happen. How are you going to handle it? So I like that sort of more pragmatic place of going to, instead of trying to like, oh, it might not be so bad. Just like, yeah, let's just assume it's bad and let's find what you've got to handle that. I like that a lot more. That kind of fits with my biases. It's probably a bit more of a Stoic view. So yeah, there's things I like about REBT. And again, with regards to things that have made a big difference to me personally, the philosophy of REBT made a big difference to me personally, changed my experience of myself and the world, how I was responding to things.
So if someone's interested in REBT, what's a good starting point or introduction to that?
Ellis wrote a number of books himself, like some self-help books.
Mm-hmm.
So just look for Albert Ellis. You'll find a bunch on Amazon. He's got a few books. Yeah, just search for Ellis.
He didn't write like, this is the REBT manual or type of a thing.
Oh, there's probably REBT manuals and things. From a practitioner perspective, there's a guy called Wendy Dryden who's written a few books, like from a practitioner perspective, like one called How to Think Like an REBT Therapist. These sorts of things. They can be good from a practitioner side. But I would recommend going to Ellis's self-help books to get the sort of core of the philosophy and the thinking.
Okay.
Again, a lot of these things have overlap. So we've talked about three principles before. There is a strong overlap between REBT and three principles. But again, the feel and the flavor of these things is so very, very different.
Solution-focused brief therapy.
So to give a little something of the history of solution-focused brief therapy, where it comes from, it actually has its roots in the work of Milton Erickson. Milton Erickson's a strong influence on solution-focused brief therapy, although what it's ended up as, most people would like go, that doesn't look anything like Erickson's stuff. It doesn't have the feel, the flavor, anything like that. But it does trace a lineage back. And that lineage, that specific lineage, is back in the 60s and going into the 70s, there was a group put together, the Palo Alto Research Institute, into brief therapy. And this is a kind of multidisciplinary group. Gregory Bateson was involved, Don Jackson, who sadly committed suicide, but a great thinker, Jay Haley, Richard Fish, John Weakland, Lynn Siegel. There's a lot of really interesting people involved in this. And they were looking at, in the sort of 50s, I think they started late 50s and into the 60s, they were interested in brief therapy. Now, at that time, therapy, the standards for therapy were like psychoanalysis, these kind of things. You were supposed to be in it for 10 years before you maybe started to make some breakthroughs.
Wow.
But that was the standard. And there weren't too many outliers around that. There was maybe some new things coming in at the time, maybe Ellis's stuff. I don't quite know the timelines of this with the rational emotive behavior therapy, which I like. Maybe Carl Rogers' stuff, but that's counseling. It's still not really aimed at fast change. But then there was this guy, Erickson, Milton H. Erickson, who apparently was doing 2, 3 sessions, sometimes with people, a lot of the time with people, and getting big impact in just a few sessions. So this group were really interested, particularly initially in Milton Erickson. They're like, what is this guy doing that gets change in such a short amount of time? And I want to make this clear. Erickson often did, but he would also sometimes work with some clients across years as well. So he wasn't hung up on, we got to get it happening fast. So they started studying Erickson, and particularly they were mostly interested in his strategic therapy side. So they were interested in his communications and his tasking and his suggestions. They saw that as being his main game, not so much his hypnotherapy. And they looked at what he was doing. And they mapped out certain principles and tenets from this. And they set up the Palo Alto Mental Research Institute Brief Therapy Unit. What they would do with this brief therapy unit, they'd take these ideas, they'd see if they could figure out what Erickson was doing. And they'd do these therapy sessions with a two-way mirror. And one person would be the therapist, but there'd be the rest of them behind the two-way mirror, watching the session and coming up with ideas. And I think they'd feed them in through an earpiece to the therapist. So it was like a kind of like a group therapy in reverse, where you'd get many therapists and the one person. And they refined these ideas across time. This group, they produced a number of books. There's The Pragmatics of Human Communication, which was an out-and-out influence on NLP. And that's where the idea, the meaning of the communication is the response that you get. That comes from that. But they also produced an excellent book called Change, Problem Formation and Problem Resolution, which is Paul Václavic, John Weakland, and Richard Fish. They did that. And then they did The Tactics of Change, which was a follow-up. That was Lynn Siegel and I think John Weakland and Richard Fish. And then they did one which was, I think, called Strategic Therapy in Intimidating Cases or something like that. They did these 3 books. Those books blew my mind when I read them. Post-NLP training, when I was initially floundering around going, what the heck am I doing with all this NLP stuff? I just felt like I was just throwing mud and I had no clue. Nothing to organize it, no organizing principles. But particularly the first 2 books, Change and The Tactics of Change, they were just like, they absolutely changed a lot for me and enabled me to really go, right, what do I want to do here, and be strategic and tactical in the application of my tools. Now, that stuff was modeled from observing Milton Erickson, but they had students come through this brief therapy unit and learn about it. And amongst these were Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg. They were students of this brief therapy center, but they didn't live locally. They ended up getting together and they got married, I think, and they moved back to Steve DeShazer's hometown of Milwaukee. And they then set up the Milwaukee Brief Therapy Research Center. And they carried on doing the same thing. They had the two-way mirror and they would do this stuff. And their work evolved into solution-focused brief therapy. So there's a number of things they ended up dropping. They dropped the tasking, which was a big part of the original solution-focused stuff. And they just got into having these conversations with people that were focused on outcomes and resources. That's it. So they were not getting into the pathology, the problem side of things. Now, this is very Ericksonian. He's just looked at everything as like, what is it this person needs to learn? And what do they already have that can contribute to that? So they took this and they developed a method of having conversations that drew out from people a new vision for what was possible for them, personal resources, things that they could connect with, and they would just weave this together in a new tapestry, let's say. And it's pretty good. I use a lot of solution-focused sensibilities and stuff. So one of the classics that they came up with is the miracle question, which is if there was a miracle that was to occur overnight and you were to wake up and this would no longer be an issue for you, what would be the first thing that would let you know? You know, that's a classic. Now, that's a version of Erickson's crystal ball technique. He'd have somebody go into a hypnotic trance and look into a hallucinated crystal ball and see the future version of themselves who no longer had the issue. So he'd do it hypnotically. The solution-focused brief therapy people found a way of doing it like just in a kind of more interview format, I guess. But I think it's really valuable work. And sometimes like I find myself falling back on it when a client seems really stuck and it just loosens so much up. It's very easy to get drawn into the idea. As I said in a different episode, I think from this one, I sort of got for a long time into doing a lot of memory reconsolidation work. That's kind of almost the opposite. We're going back into stuff where people have got significant negative formative memories and we reprocess them. That can be really powerful work, but it's not for everybody. And sometimes people get stuck doing that work and you shift gears into just resource focus, solution focus, and the whole system frees up and they get back into their creative mind and start weaving new possibilities and options. So sometimes I really ground and center myself in it. And then sometimes I'll get pulled back into more memory reconsolidation stuff, but very, very valuable. I would recommend anybody make a study of the solution-focused brief therapy material.
What would be like a starting point for someone? Is one of the books you mentioned, or?
There's a pretty good book, actually. It's called Solution-Focused Brief Therapy, 100 Key Points and Techniques by Harvey Ratner and Evan George and Chris Iveson. I really liked that. I think that's a very good orientation to it. I'm sure there's other books that there are other books I've read on that. I just don't particularly remember them because at the time that I was diving into that, and again, that's something I'm not trained in. I read another book called The Solution Focused Diamond, which when it gets to the point, it has a long intro talking about how the co-authors collaborate together and all of this and sharing some of their personal grievances with the solution focused brief therapy world. And then they finally get to the meat of it. And it's quite a good book. That's called The Solution Focused Diamond, and I'm forgetting the names of the authors. But there are lots and lots of books on solution focused brief therapy. To me, if you're a changework practitioner and you don't have any idea of that or any grounding in it, I would strongly recommend checking it out, particularly if the paradigms that you operate in are mostly past focused and focusing on kind of the etiology of the problem and all of this sort of thing. It will create a very different set of lenses for you to engage through.
Okay. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope, just like me, you found some new, interesting material you weren't aware of before. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions or comments, you can reach us at changeworkingpod@gmail.com. See you next time.
Changeworking is produced by Ruckus Sky. For information on training, go to clientshifts.com.